Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Father-Son Packers podcast, your source for Packers news, notes, and analysis. My name is Tommy, and I'm one of your hosts, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, my dad, Matt. Dad, how you doing?
I'm still here. So remember last episode, I had COVID, and then I didn't. And now I've got
back.
rebound COVID.
Like it never left. But so your, a bit fittingly, your part 2 of COVID is joined by our part 2 of the NFC North preview. See how I did that transition? It's very seamless, very nonchalant, very casual.
Brilliant pod leading.
And this is the first take, so I'm just ripping this off.
The first take, yeah. This is, but by the time you hear this, will this be the first take?
I was going to say, this is the first take that many of you may never hear. We might just end up stopping because I stumble over a few words, as we are want to do. But anyway, we are here today, like I mentioned, to finish our preview of the NFC North, position group by position group. We're going to be talking about the offense in this one, so if you want to go back and listen to the defense one, we did that in the last episode, so that's just right back in the queue, one episode, so go check that out. We also talked about the Jair Alexander signing in Baltimore, some of the other stuff around that. We don't really have any news to discuss today because we are in the doldrums of, the season.
Find anything.
No.
We were just talking about even more random stuff than usual before we started.
Yeah, we were like, is it worth discussing that Rodgers mentioned this might be his last year? And we immediately were both like, no. Not particularly. We can talk about that.
But that's already more air than it deserves.
Exactly. It's like we have that's the closest thing to Packers news we've gotten, really, because we also talked about the Ed policy a little bit last episode as well, just briefly. So there's not really a whole lot of news to touch on. So we're mostly just going to be talking about the NFC North, what's going on there.
Right.
Before we do
the Packers still have an empty roster spot. Is that right?
I think that's right. I don't think they've filled. Yeah, I don't know if they filled that yet. So
we haven't had the monster news that's going to fill that.
I was going to say
roster spot.
Yeah, when they trade for Trey Hendrickson any day now. I'm sure he's on the way. I'm sure the paperwork's just in the mail. But anyway, before we get into any of that, though, just want to pitch a couple of things. Like, subscribe, tell a friend, leave a review, leave a comment. We would really appreciate it. We love talking with everyone, related to, Packers stuff. If you want to, have a discussion about what we're talking about, if you disagree, if you agree, if you have a question about maybe some of what we're talking about and whether or not we thought about something, just leave a comment. We'd love to talk to you about it. Or you can, message us or, post with us on Blue Sky at FatherSonPacker. If you want to follow us there, we also, post out whenever we have new episodes, content from other Packers content creators, Packers roster news, Packers roster moves, other Packers related news, and contract extensions, et cetera, et cetera. You'll be the first to know there when Elton Jenkins ends up getting his extension, hopefully, or a rework deal, hopefully. That's another thing we're just kind of keeping our eye on, just waiting. It's like, is that going to happen?
You would have maybe thought, now that we freed up that money, we're ready to. There's going to be some big signings.
Yeah, because
none of that has happened yet.
Yeah, there was some rumors Zach Tom wants top 3 right tackle money, which I guess we can talk about for a second. I mean, yeah, I would too.
I haven't seen that rumor.
That makes sense to me. There was another rumor. Do you remember who Pretty Ricky, or not Pretty Ricky? No, it is Pretty Ricky. Yeah, the guy on Twitter, who was doing all the news breaking around Ayuk last offseason. I don't know if you remember that. And then he was like, Ayuk's going to go to the Steelers, and if he doesn't, I'm going to delete my account. And then Ayuk did not go to the Steelers. But anyway, he was saying, this is the level of news we have at this point in the year. He was saying the Packers are looking to extend Rasheed Walker, which to me is I don't believe that.
I did hear somebody mention this on a podcast.
So I want to point out, I want to just say, there's no actual sourcing. This is not an actual report. This is just a rumor, but there is a rumor that they were looking to extend Walker, which I don't believe, because why would you draft tackles in back-to-back drafts? But
and also, this is a guy who was predicting Ayuk to the Steelers last year.
Exactly. But apparently that was to the point where in Ricky's defense, which I don't believe this guy is a real source at all, but that deal was apparently to the end line essentially, and then Kyle Shanahan ran up. There's stories Kyle Shanahan ran up the stairs to the John Lynch's office and told them, "Hey, don't trade him, please. Just extend him, give him $30 million a year." But so apparently that was very close to happening. But I will say I would be surprised if Walker is the one that they end up extending and not Tom, and I'd be more surprised if that, and I'd still be surprised if they ended up extending both, given the draft capital they've put into the position over the last couple of years and what tackles are going.
So the only way I see that happening
is if he takes a deal, a below market deal.
Oh, I'm thinking more bye Elton.
But then
Tom moves to center. So I'm talking crazy town.
You can't. This is an audio platform, but my eyes just went wide with that take. I mean, there was that report last offseason, wasn't it, from Domovsky that was like they think he could be a All-Pro center. It's like, well,
no. It was like Pro Bowl tackle, All-Pro guard, Hall of Fame center.
Which, what are we doing here? You know, like, and we're talking about a report from a guy on Twitter with a dog avatar. So, like, what are we actually doing here? But the fact of the matter is, just to circle back,
it's
we
that
still
time
have,
of the year, folks.
I was going to say, we still have no news on potential extensions for Tom, rework deal for Elton, or maybe even an extension for Walker, or maybe even an extension for Ryan if you can get him below market. Which,
all three of them.
Yeah. I mean, if you could talk me into it, I guess. I wouldn't love it, but you could talk me into it, I guess.
It wouldn't shock me if Ryan got an extension because I don't expect him to command a lot of money.
Well, you just see what guards are getting paid, though. I'm okay, here's my question. How would you compare Ryan to Runyon? Like, Ryan's only done it for 1 year, but I would say the 1 year of Ryan is probably as good as any 1 year from Runyon.
Runyon had one pretty good year.
The thing is, Runyon was way better at pass protecting, and Ryan is a better run blocker, in my opinion. Runyon was never a very good run blocker. He's just not a people mover. So, and then Runyon got, what, 12 a year? 10 a year?
I think it was 10. I think it was 3 years, 30.
So you'd have to think that Ryan would at least get the uptick of that with probably like 3 years, 36 to 40. So assuming he has another good year this year, like last year, like where he's a quality, like average to above average starting guard, I just don't think so.
My thing for Ryan is it's kind of the same thing as Logan's like, is he the center of the future? After
Ryan, I mean, they have been repping him at center. That we got Jacob Monk. Don't worry. But anyway, so
we'll Jacob Monk is taking snaps. And all break to commercial.
And that's the thing,
he's not in the game.
The whole like offensive line future kind of does hinge on what they decide to do with Elton and like if they extend him. So we'll see, but we'll keep you tuned to that. Once again, follow us on Blue Sky.
There are a whole lot of moving parts of the offensive line right now.
Yeah, but that's pretty much all we really have to say about like news related stuff. Is like we have no news on extensions.
Yeah,
There's no
news,
rumors.
so we're just making up stuff.
Well, someone is. Right. Someone's making up stuff. But anyway, yeah, it's June. It's June in the NFL calendar. But anyway, that does mean we are going to talk a little bit about the NFC North offenses and where we think the Packers stack up position group by position group. Now, before we do get into any of that, we're going to talk a little bit about our methodology around that. But we figure we should probably talk first about notable additions, subtractions, arrivals, departures for each team. So going through, each team, a lot of flux this offseason around the NFC North. Last year it was one of the most competitive divisions in the NFL. It's looking like it's going to be that again this year. And so a lot of teams gearing up on both sides of the ball. There were a lot of additions and subtractions on the defensive side of the ball, and that pattern follows on the offensive side of the ball. So starting with the Packers, obviously we've talked about this a lot, but the big addition on offense was signing Aaron Banks and then letting Josh Myers walk. So, kind of moving Elton over to center and having Banks hopefully step into that left guard spot. And then they also, of course, the other big addition was adding Matthew Golden in the first round and then Savion Williams in the third round. So some more additions to the wide receiver room, as well as signing Mecole Hardman. But we're not going to focus too much on these smaller signings. And then adding Anthony Belton in the second round to the offensive line room, kind of hopefully bolstering some of that offensive line depth, some of that offensive line competition. But those are the main additions along the offensive side of the ball and subtractions along the offensive side of the ball for the Packers. Moving down the list, the Lions, their big loss was not necessarily on the field, although they did have one of those as well, but losing offensive coordinator Ben Johnson, who had been one of the top play callers in the league for the past several years, kind of piloting those top 5, top 10 offenses over the last few years. And he has moved on to take the head coaching job in Chicago. So we'll talk about that when we get to the Bears additions. But so losing him, big loss there. They've hired John Morton to fill that spot. He was the passing game coordinator for Denver last year, and he had actually previously worked with the Lions as a senior offensive assistant. So there is some familiarity within, it's not like he's totally new to that group, to that team. He knows the players, but they are bringing in someone from the outside. So we're going to see how that goes. That's obviously an unknown there. Is they're also replacing their DC, which we talked about last week. They're replacing their OC out of house. So that's something slightly different from what they did on defense. Although, like I said, there is some familiarity there. He has coached in that room before. The other big loss, though, which I mentioned briefly, which is on the field, is they lost their center, Frank Ragnow, to retirement. Early retirement. Seems like his body had just kind of given out on him, unfortunately. He had been, in my opinion, the best center in the league over the past couple of years and one of the better offensive linemen in the league, period. He was always a pain in the ass to play against. I mean, we've talked about this before, right? Like how annoying he was to play against, because he was just, it's incredible. You just know, you don't see centers that big very often who can still move really fast. And I do think that like his standing in them having to play him like multiple times a year, every single year, is part of the reason they drafted Josh Myers in the first place. Is like Josh Myers is also huge for a center, and they were like, we can get our Frank Ragnow. And it's like, no, actually, there aren't that many Frank Ragnows. Like that, he's a special talent, and it does stink that he was forced to retire early with injury, and it's going to be really hard for them to replace him. Now they did draft Tate Ratledge in the second round, who it sounds like they're going to try and train at guard and have him take over for that spot. But obviously that's a huge loss. And then they also lost guard Kevin Zeitler, who left and I believe went to the Titans, if I'm not mistaken. But so they're replacing multiple spots along their interior offensive line. But the big one there is Ragnow. And I know you're a big Ragnow fan because you were always like, man, if we could just have Frank Ragnow on our team, think about how good the run game would be. But that's definitely a big loss on the field there.
Yeah, that was the guy I was always taking in a lot of those drafting other players in the NFC North kind of exercises.
He was like your 101. Like you were like, I'd take him first overall. It's like I'd still take Justin Jefferson, but to each their own. But
yeah, so this is the funny thing. So and we'll talk about Ben Johnson going from the Lions to the Bears, but this is a narrow path to thread for a lot of people. Like, okay, are you going to say that simultaneously that losing Ben Johnson has no effect on the Lions, and yet he's going to have this massive upgrade on the Bears because he's so good?
I was going to say, the question, I guess, is just like, what is John Morton? Because, like, the argument for that is, like, Bo Nix looked a lot better than anyone thought he was going to last year. And so you got to give Morton some credit for that.
Bo Nix is good. And I think a lot of people actually, my understanding from that, but I hadn't really thought about Morton and Bo Nix, is giving Dan Campbell all the credit.
Yeah, I mean, I think Dan Campbell gets certainly some credit. I think he does more schematically than I think he gets credit for. I don't think he is just like this. Like people talk about him as like a CEO coach. Like he's just hyping guys up. Like he's just out there like for good vibes. I think he does a little more than he gets credit for, and it's just like kind of his personality makes you think he's not really a scheme guy. But I do think
Campbell has this way of presenting himself as a total meathead.
But he's way more analytically inclined than like any of these other
really
guys.
Goes with the analytics all the time. He like follows the numbers.
Yeah, no, he's a good head coach. But no, so I do think losing Ben Johnson's going to be a hit there. I mean, he's been their play caller for multiple years. He's gotten the most out of Jared Goff. But we'll see what Morton's able to bring to that and how much having a good infrastructure of players, and losing that interior O-line, two of those pieces there is certainly going to be hard on the run game, which has been like kind of the staple of what their offense is, like the bedrock of it. But that's definitely going to be something to see. Like, can you count on a rookie to play center right away? It's like that's kind of
we'll talk about that when we get to the offensive line group.
Yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit more. Moving on to the Vikings, most notably, new quarterback, Sam Darnold, who I think
the most important thing that I kind of left out when I first started putting notes in, it was not the first thing I mentioned.
Yeah, you were putting in it's a big deal to like be changing out big stretches of your offensive line as well for the Vikings, which we'll talk about in a second. But you did just totally skip over the fact they're going to have an entirely new starting quarterback.
A new starting quarterback who has not played a snap in the NFL.
Yeah, or at least not in a regular season game. But yeah, so Sam Darnold, who I think blew everyone's expectations away, and how much of that was him figuring things out, how much of that was Kevin O'Connell. I guess we'll see this year.
Find out.
Yeah, we'll see this year. But so he is out the door. He has gone over to the Seahawks. And meanwhile, J.J. McCarthy, who they took in the first round this past year and unfortunately missed most of his entire first year except for a preseason game with a meniscus injury, he is going to come in and be the starter, it sounds like. And so we'll see what he is. So for our projections, we're going to be treating him like a rookie, seeing as he didn't really play any snaps. Although you could argue like, oh, he's gotten some more mental reps than a rookie would normally get, which is true. So it's a little bit in the middle, but we'll talk about that when we get to methodology. But like I mentioned, they also added 3 new starters on the interior offensive line, guard Will Fries and center Ryan Kelly, both from the Colts. And then they drafted Donovan Jackson, a guard out of Ohio State, in the first round. So 3 new pieces along the interior offensive line, completely revamped interior offensive line. So that's, a place where they had some trouble last year because, they had trouble protecting Sam Darnold down the stretch a little bit, and that contributed to some of his issues, we'll say, in the last 2 games of the year.
Ghosts.
Yeah. And then they also added running back Jordan Mason from San Francisco, who played quite well in CMC's absence last year. And so he's going to probably spell Aaron Jones a little bit there, give him a little bit more of a 1-2 punch there in the running game. And so I think they're hoping.
Backups were kind of weak last year.
It was Akers, right? Again, like somehow he got his way back to the Vikings, for the 3rd time. They just can't quit him.
But so it looks like they'll backup will be a little stronger this year based on how well Mason was able to perform when he needed to, when the Niners needed him to.
I mean, yeah, it was, what was it called? He was like top 3 in the league in rushing yards after like 8 weeks, 7 weeks, something like that. I mean, he was a very capable backup, and I think they're hoping that with like the addition of him and then more interior offensive line help, they're able to have a more stable running game. And so it's not just pure like passing game for a rookie quarterback, and maybe an infrastructure that counts on him a little bit less, which will be a bit similar to what he had at Michigan, and that was a scenario, like an ecosystem where he had a lot of success at Michigan. So maybe they're trying to replicate that a little bit, but we'll talk about that a bit. And when we talk about moving to looking at their running game and looking at their offensive line as well. Over to Chicago, completely different, coaching staff, which we talked about with the defense, but Ben Johnson coming in as head coach is probably like the number one thing to talk about. He was probably the, most sought after head coaching candidate in this entire offseason cycle. So he was definitely
the last 2 years.
Probably, yeah, because there was all that talk about how Washington really wanted him last offseason, and he ended up saying no. So, and a bunch of teams wanted him last offseason, but apparently Washington was very close to getting him, and he ended up saying no, and he wanted to stay another year with Detroit. And then this offseason, he goes to Chicago. He's, piloted those top 5, top 10 offenses for Detroit over the last few years. And so they're hoping that he can come in and kind of get that offense back on track after it kind of struggled a little bit last year, and get Caleb Williams a bit back on track after he struggled a little bit last year. So that's the big addition, but they're also adding a lot around that offense as well, because they're kind of just going all in on like, hey, we need to make this offense work. Like that's the number one priority, which totally makes sense. It's the right decision. But they're making a bunch of additions along the offensive line as well, along the interior offensive line as well. What is the theme for the NFC North, which we'll talk about with offensive lines? Totally revamped interiors for like all 4 teams.
This is true. There's a lot of changes in the offensive line interior. Some improvements, but not for everybody.
Yeah, the Lions are. I guess we'll see. Maybe Tate Ratledge is very good right away, but yeah, it's definitely a lot of change. But they added 3 new players: Joe Thuney, who they traded for from the Chiefs; Drew Dahlman, who they signed in free agency previously of the Falcons. He's going to be playing center for them. And then Jonah Jackson, who they traded for from the Rams. And then they also drafted Ozzie Trapillo in the 2nd round. So some additions along that offensive line, and specifically that interior offensive line, where they're bringing in 3 new starters pretty much, or guys who they hope are 3 new starters. They also added tight end Colston Loveland in the 1st round with the 10th overall pick, and then wide receiver Luther Burden in the 2nd round after losing wide receiver Keenan Allen in free agency, although he is still available, so maybe he'll be back, but it doesn't sound like it. But so a lot of changes there as well, specifically along the coaching staff. With Ben Johnson coming in, he's also bringing in an entirely new, assistant coaching group. Like that's all new as well. So entirely new coaching staff, entirely new interior offensive line, new pass catchers, new weapons to go with the weapons that they already had, which they already had several of those. But yeah, so a lot of changes there as well. But Dad, any last things on the additions and subtractions, arrivals, departures of any of these teams that you wanted to touch on, or should we go over to previewing each of the position groups?
I think we can go ahead to the position groups, because that is where we're going to talk about what these additions and subtractions mean.
Okay, well, do you want to start with just a brief, quick summary of our methodology for people who didn't necessarily catch the last one?
Right. For you people who didn't memorize what we did last week, we got the depth chart from our lads for each team, and then we took their PFF grades from their most recent year, which is almost always last year. And then all the position groups were made equal. So we have, I think in this case, this year we decided to go with 7 offensive linemen, 5 receivers, 3 running backs, 3 tight ends, and 1 QB. We did not include backup QBs in this analysis, which may but
it does seem like every year backup quarterbacks are playing more than they have in the past. It seems like every single year, especially.
You could say that would have helped the Packers if we did, but as we're not practicing EFT.
Yeah, that's the was it. I don't remember the old Colts coordinator. Maybe it was Bruce Arians, although I'm not entirely sure if that's true. I might be just making that one up. No, because he would. Well, maybe it was. Anyway,
I don't remember who actually said it, but it was it was regarding Peyton Manning.
Yeah, I mean, if you were ranking backup quarterbacks in the NFC North, I mean, Malik Willis won
for sure,
and then you're going down the list. It's Teddy Bridgewater with the Lions. It's Tyson Bagent with the Bears, and it's I don't even know who the Vikings backup quarterback is.
I don't know because they didn't get Daniel Jones back. They didn't get Aaron Rodgers.
No, although apparently he wanted them to. It's Sam Howell. That's right. They went and added Sam Howell. I'd take Malik Willis over Sam Howell. I saw how both of them played last year. But anyway, yeah, if you're ranking backup quarterbacks, I mean, for me, Malik Willis, best backup quarterback in the league. So that's just my take. But anyway, continue with the methodology.
And so the idea is to get a snap share adjusted PFF grade for each position group. And so what we've done is we've taken the depth chart from our lads. So whoever is like running back one gets whatever that team's running back one snap share was from last year. Not how many snaps that actual player had. So if somebody like moves up or down the depth chart, they get the snap share based on their position in the depth chart, not on what they did before. And so for the offensive line, did something a little bit differently. I actually calculated the average snap count for the starters, the top 5 snap players for every team in the league. So we could get an idea of what's the actual share. And then what I gave all 5 of those starters the same number of snaps, which ends up being like 967 on average for the year for all players who are the top 5 on their team. And then I calculated also the average number of snaps for offensive lineman number 6 and offensive lineman number 7, which ends up being like 424 snaps for OLine 6 and 244 for OLine 7. And so then that gives us their share of the contribution to the offensive line and the PFF grade for the quality of that contribution.
And like we always say, PFF grade, not perfect, totally, like that's something to always keep in mind. PFF grade is kind of like it correlates with good football play, is what I would say. It is not
I think if you did a scatter plot, they would be genuinely clustered together.
Yeah, if you had some way to like get the true value of like how good a player actually is, it would be correlated with PFF grade. PFF grade is not a perfect like analysis of how good a player actually is. There's some misses, there's some things it doesn't necessarily capture, but it's a decent catch-all stat. But as always, it's not gospel. It's not perfect, but it's like, and the other it's reason, something. It's a decent catch-all stat.
One of the main reasons for using it for us is like, they do it for every position. So you get a score for every position. You can't say, okay, like they're like 6 metrics, which we have actually for quarterbacks.
And I was going to say, for quarterbacks, we kind of have we looked at 6 different metrics because there's no like snap weighted share. Like there's not like, we're just, because otherwise we'd just be like, this is what the PFF grade for them was last year. And like, we'd just be telling you the rankings.
And if you say like, well, PFF isn't necessarily the best, and there are more metrics for quarterbacks than for anything else.
Yes. Yeah, so specifically for quarterbacks, I think it's the big thing. So for quarterbacks, we are looking at a combination of like 5 or 6 different metrics and looking at the rankings there. Because otherwise it'd be like, well, Jared Goff had the best PFF grade last year. Jordan Love had the second best PFF grade last year. And then for rookies, though, we do have our different methodology there.
Right. So for rookies, you're always like, okay, what rookies don't have any history in the NFL. So we are estimating a grade for rookies based on the median PFF grade for all rookies at that same position drafted in the same round that they were. So we take over the last.
So if you're looking at, for instance, if you're looking at
7 years,
like, okay, how are you capturing how good you think Anthony Belton is? Well, what we did was you look at all the tackles drafted in the second round over the last 10 years and took the median of what their grades were in their rookie year. And we just kind of, assume, that he'll be around the average there, around the median. We're doing median to remove some of the outlier stuff where it's like, oh man, this guy was terrible. Oh man, this guy was amazing.
So he could be at the top of the distribution, or he could be at the bottom, but we're choosing as a kind of the most likely outcome.
Right in the middle.
These players are going to be in the middle of the distribution for their position and draft position.
Yeah.
So that gives us an estimate of what to expect. Even last year's PFF grade for players in the NFL is only an estimate of what they're going to be this coming year.
Exactly. But anyway, Should we start off with the quarterbacks? Because like we mentioned, This is the one we did slightly differently, where we're looking at 6 different metrics. What are those numbers that we're looking at?
All right, so we have passer rating. That thing's been around forever, but passer rating, ESPN's QBR, the PFF grade, overall grade, not just passing grade, but their overall grade, adjusted EPA per play, that we got from RBS. I got from RBSDM. Success rate, I also got from RBSDM, and completion percentage over expectation, which is also from RBSDM.
Yeah, and then we looked at their ranks amongst the division in those, and then averaged the ranks amongst those. So, like, let's start off. Who ended up first when you averaged out those ranks?
So Goff ended up first, and he ended up first in 5 of the 6 metrics. And so he had a great year last year, and environment was good for him last year as well.
True,
but he had a fantastic year. He had the best pass rating, the best PFF grade, the best EPA per play, the best success rate, and the best completion percentage over expected. He was second in QBR. Now, the second best overall average is Jordan Love, who was number 2, who was second in 5 of the metrics and ended up first in ESPN's QBR. He beat out Goff in QBR and finished second to Goff in all the other 3 metrics. So clearly, QBR is the number one metric we should be following here.
In fact, we just remove the rest. And next year we'll pick a different one, whichever Love is first in. But anyway,
I'm hoping to be first in all of them.
That's true. That's a good point right there. Anyway, who's third and who's fourth?
So third, we go with Caleb Williams, ended up finishing third. He was third in. Well,
this one is actually a tie.
This was a tie. McCarthy and Caleb Williams ended up tied. They both finished third in 3 of the metrics and fourth in the other 3.
Yes, and that for McCarthy, it is the projection of what a rookie quarterback normally is. So you could say.
So I calculated the median for all 6 of these metrics for all first-round QBs over the last 7 years. Figure that if as a 10th overall pick, he's kind of in the middle.
Although you could say fair enough.
Last year, when I was trying to figure out Caleb Williams, I only did number 1 overall QBs.
Because more representative sample. Yep.
You figure that'd be a more accurate sample, and I went back like 11 years to get more number 1 overall QBs. But for McCarthy, I figured since he was closer to the middle, he's like the number 5 QB on the year. I thought it was more accurate to go for all first round QBs.
Was he the 5th quarterback drafted, or was he the 6th quarterback drafted? No, 5th. He was before Bo Nix. That's right. But Penix and then the guys who went 1, 2, 3 were all ahead of him. So, 5th quarterback drafted.
Yeah, and so it kind of would expect him to be in somewhere. He could be better, but this is where you think the most likely prediction would be.
And he is going into a situation just so those are our projected rankings based on how they performed last year and just what they're.
And that McCarthy ranking, incorporates Caleb Williams' performance last year.
Yes. That's true. It does. It gets put into that average as part of the sample. I will say, so let's just talk about it a little bit. Jared Goff, I would say, going to have a worse environment than he had previously. Losing his play caller, losing his center, losing another one of the guards. So probably a slightly worse, not a bad situation. Still going to be in a good situation, but a slightly worse situation. Guys like Caleb Williams and JJ McCarthy. On the other hand, Caleb Williams is going to be having, we would assume, a much better situation.
It looks like a much better situation. He had a bad offensive line last year, at least up the middle.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about that.
We'll talk about the offensive line in a little bit. But the big thing is new play caller. I think Shane Waldron just was not a good play caller for that job. You hear about it just wasn't a good fit.
Was like watching tape on his own.
Yeah, that was at least the report, which is a little bit crazy. Or just not being told what to watch, which is also maybe a little bit, that's a little surprising as well. But so should be a better situation for him with Ben Johnson coming in, who has a track record of having really good offenses under his watch. And then JJ McCarthy, also a very good situation, we assume, with Kevin O'Connell kind of reviving Sam Darnold's career last year. I mean, I don't think anyone would have possibly imagined that they would win 14 games with Sam Darnold. And then Kevin O'Connell kind of puts together an offense that is very well catered to him. And then you also have to keep in mind, Justin Jefferson It's not a bad first option for a rookie. And then Jordan Addison, solid number 2 wide receiver, and would probably be a 1B on most teams without like a true like alpha top 2, top 1 receiver in the league. And then you still got Hawkinson, you got Aaron Jones, you got a decent offensive line, assuming Darisaw's back healthy, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So both of them should have much better situation, or Caleb Williams should have a much better situation than he had last year, we assume. And then JJ McCarthy is probably going into maybe the best situation of any quarterback in the league. And then Jordan Love it's pretty much the same situation he had last year, except we think maybe some slight improvements along the offensive line and maybe some progression in the pass catcher room, and then another investment at wide receiver. But I guess
don't forget offensive rookie of the year, Matthew Golden.
Hopefully, but that's
the
what
first
I was saying
name
about.
alone is going to carry him to stardom.
Yes, it's great first name. But anyway, I did mention that with some pass catcher additions as well there, and first round receiver taken by the Packers since 2002.
05?
So no, 2002. Yes, in 23 years. But anyway, all that is to say, I'm kind of pointing that out. So the projections are Goff, Love, Williams, McCarthy based on last year. Looking forward to this year, the ecosystems are maybe coming closer together, getting squished closer together, with Goff's getting a little bit worse, and then Williams and McCarthy's kind of coming up a little bit. And so maybe that squishes together the quarterback rankings as well, possibly.
Yeah, and the other thing, I maybe, and think about the Vikings in particular, maybe who we should be comparing McCarthy to is just Sam Darnold.
Yeah. I mean,
that's kind of going to be his yardstick for this year, I would think. Can he be as good as Sam Darnold? And I think before last year, most people would say, I sure hope so.
Yeah. I mean, if he can put up the numbers that Darnold had last year, I mean, if you had just taken out the last 2 games, like if he just hadn't played those, like the games got canceled or whatever.
He lost a lot of
like,
money over those last 2
yeah,
games.
I was going to say, he probably would have gotten like 45 a year. And I think as it stood, he got like 30 something. So like he lost probably about $50 million all said and told over those 2 games. But before those games, I mean, he was looking like, I was like, hey, this guy's like going to be a starter in the league for a while. I mean, he won 14 games. He threw there's like 35 plus touchdowns. Numbers. Yeah. I mean, he had a fantastic season. And so going into last year, I don't think anyone would have expected that from Darnold. And so McCarthy's going into a situation where we've already seen a quarterback who we going into the year didn't think that much of, put up great numbers in this offense. McCarthy's going into a great situation for a rookie quarterback.
Yeah, and this is the other thing that a lot of these like rookie numbers don't necessarily capture, is how different the situation is that each one of these rookies is coming into in any of the positions.
Yeah, and I do think over time, I think what we've seen is like, for rookie quarterbacks, the ecosystem matters maybe more than anything. Like maybe more than what they did in college. Maybe more. I would love to look at how predictive like college stats are, how predictive measurables are, and how predictive just the team that is around them is. And I think the more we're seeing, I think that team around them might be the most predictive part of like how good
imagine if
a rookie quarterback
coaching
is.
Him this year.
Oh, man. But anyway, so that all that is to say though is like we could see some like shuffling there with the changes in the ecosystems around these quarterbacks based on, because like we were looking at the numbers from last year, but a lot of those, a lot of quarterback play is ecosystem driven, play caller driven, weapons driven, offensive line driven. And so we're going to see this year how predictive those stats from last year are when a lot of things are changing around these quarterbacks, or at least around 3 of these quarterbacks. Anything else on the QBs you want to touch on? I feel like this is the part where like there's not a whole lot to discuss here. I think it's a little more interesting to talk about some of these other position groups. I think it's one of the stronger divisions in terms of quarterback play, assuming that Caleb Williams can improve from year 1 and assuming that McCarthy comes in and is at least like a Sam Darnold floor there, which I think they're hoping he is.
Yeah, they're probably hoping that's just his floor. But we don't know.
No, we don't.
Teams have been wrong before.
I think it's going to be like I was saying, though, a really good division for quarterback play and for play callers. I mean, you have, what would you say? I mean, Matt LaFleur, Ben Johnson, Kevin O'Connell, at least over the past 3 years, have been 3 of the 6 best, 3 of the 7 best play callers in the entire league. And then Dan Campbell, I mean, we'll see how much he is involved in that. I guess we'll see what the offense looks like this year. But I don't want to, I don't want to snub him. So he deserves at least some of the credit for what the offense has been. But yeah, so I think, in terms of looking at play callers and then in terms of looking at quarterbacks, this could be a really fun year for offense in the NFC North.
So you're putting those 3 along with McVay, Shanahan, and Reed.
McVay, Shanahan, Reed, and then I'm sure there's one that, like, off the top of my head, I'm just forgetting. Where do you put Sean Payton? Where do you put some of these, like, other, like, Shanahan style play callers? I'm just trying to think off the top of my head. But I just say top 6, top 7. I just didn't want to make sure I wasn't leaving anyone out. But yeah, they're in that conversation. But anyway, let's move on though to our next section, which is offensive line. Where do this ranking surprised me the most, I will say.
Yeah, this is surprised me a little bit too, because it's changed a lot from last year. And of course, we talked about how the Bears and Vikings have remade 60% of each of their starting offensive lines.
Both the Bears and the Vikings have replaced, or at least hope to have replaced, all 3 of their interior offensive line spots. And then the Lions are replacing 2 of those, although I guess, not by choice. They would have preferred to have kept both those guys. And then the Packers, they're changing 2 of those spots too, with, bringing in a new left guard and then moving their previous left guard, Elton, to center. And so there's a lot of change along the interiors of all of these offensive lines in the division. And so that probably contributes a little bit to why these rankings are so different from what we might assume.
Yeah, so we could start with just the overall rankings of them. Number 1, which I think if anybody watched the Bears last year, would be a surprise, because the Bears finished number 1 in this snap share weighted PFF grade with a 73.98 overall score. That is up 7 points from last year. Last year, their expected score going in was about 67. So it's a huge change. Mm-hmm. If you break it down, they're projected to be good in both pass blocking and run blocking, with both of them just over 70 as a score. Just for reference again, 60 is sort of the midline average for PFF score. Number 2 are the Vikings with a 73.7 score, also up 7 points from last year. And it's funny, they're even though their overall was not quite as good, but almost identical, their breakdown of pass and run were both a little bit higher than the Bears' breakdown of pass and run at 72. The Lions are 3rd overall, the 72.8 grade, so still pretty close. So you got 2 in the high 73s, 1 in the high 72s, but they're down 6.9 from last year. So they had a super elite over 77 projected grade for their offensive line group last year. So they're hurting a lot from what they've lost from last year. And their passing protection is only 67.1, while their run is still good at 72.4. So they've lost a lot in the pass pro. The Packers come in 4th in the overall grade, only 68.2. So a pretty substantial step down, but still up 3.9 points from last year. So the Bears, Vikings, and Packers have all improved. The Packers have an interesting breakdown of their the blocking. Their pass blocking is 72.3, which is actually first in the division. But their run blocking projection is 65.2, way below everybody else. Everybody else like 70, 72, 72. And this is this is an improvement, actually. This is not only what we expected to be, we were trying to improve. This is an improvement over last year. I think last year the projection was like 62 for the run blocking.
But Dad, think about how much less fun it would be to watch Josh Jacobs highlights if the run blocking was good. Like, it would just be so much more boring if he wasn't making 5 guys miss every single time.
We want to see those backfield jump cuts.
But that is part of the thing where, like, when you look at Josh Jacobs' season last year, it's great. And then when you look at it in the context of the run blocking really being poor for most of the year, it's even better. And that is a problem for the Packers, and I think that's a big reason why they brought in Aaron Banks, is they hope that he can help with that run blocking. And I think that's part of the reason that they would like Jordan Morgan to win that left tackle job, is because he's a better run blocker, or at least projects to be a better run blocker than Rasheed Walker. And
Walker's pass blocking grade was much better than his run blocking grade. If you look at the Packers, the only person who actually has a good run blocking grade is Zach Tom.
Yeah,
who has an elite run blocking grade as well as an elite pass blocking grade.
Yeah, and I would say Sean Ryan, I would say, is a a decent run blocker, even though he didn't grade out well there. Elton should be a better run blocker maybe than he was last year. I think he's shown it in the past. But, we can only go off of what they've done most recently. And so when you're looking at, what these offensive lines project as, when you're looking at reasons these projections might be different, I think the big thing is health. So when you're looking at the Bears being number one, a lot of that is predicated on Jonah Jackson getting back to form. He only played 4 games last year. And so that's kind of a big gamble there. He has not been healthy last year, and even going back, only 4 games last year, only 12 games the year before that. So he's missed some time. And so him, being available is going to be a big impact there on the Bears offensive line with them bringing him in to play right guard. Looking down the list, the other thing with the Lions is we're projecting Christian Mahogany to grade out very well. He did that in a limited role last year. So that's also a bit of a question mark of him moving into a full-time role. So that's a bit of a question mark there as well. And then I did
like him coming out of the draft. He was a guy I wanted the Packers to pick in like the 4th or 5th round, wherever he went.
No, he ended up falling to like the 6th, I think, because of injury concerns. I think was the reason there. But so that's also a projection as well. And then also, we're just not sure what the rest of that, like, does the rest of the interior look less good there without Ragnow helping them out? Is also, a question. You don't have the same guy setting the projections.
Do you see a drag on everybody else's grade without Ragnow there?
Yeah. And then the other question mark is Darisaw for the Vikings coming back healthy, hopefully. But, he tore his ACL, halfway through last year. So that's something to keep in mind as well there. But yeah, so I was surprised to see the Packers so low on this list. Now, when you tell me the thing that was really dragging them down was the run blocking, that makes a lot more sense because the run blocking it's incredible for a team that is so run heavy to just be so bad at run blocking. And
but they're improving
year after year.
At least now they're above average.
That's true. And I guess, I think part of that's going to be, removing Josh Myers from the equation because as tantalizing as the flashes were, he was just never a consistent player. And then Aaron Banks, coming in might be their best or second best run blocker, or at least I think that's what they're hoping he could be. He's only been an above average run blocker, I think once by PFF grade in the last few seasons. But that's what they're hoping he can be.
And I think they're hoping he's going to be more like he was in the first half of the year than the second half of the year.
Yeah. And so I do think if you want to make the case for why the Packers offensive line might end up being better compared to the rest of the division than we're projecting, continuity, I think, is the big thing. Because you look at these other offensive lines, 3 new interior pieces for the Bears, 3 new interior pieces for the Vikings, new starting center who has never played in the NFL before for the Lions, and then a left guard who we assume he's going to play left guard. I guess they might switch that up, but a guard who has played mostly limited snaps before. The Packers have the most continuity along the offensive line, really only bringing in 1 new piece projected, assuming Walker's going to start. And then Morgan also was, he was with the team last year and played along the offensive line. Although you could argue the same thing as Mahogany, where he played, limited snaps and at a different position. So, but the Packers probably have the most continuity there. And so if you want to tell yourself, hey, they'll finish higher, that's probably the argument, right?
Right. And the other thing about this is not grading the sum of the whole unit. This is grading the individual players and summing that up to give a approximate grade for the offensive line unit, which doesn't always mean the same thing as how the unit performs on the whole.
No, it does not.
And so that familiarity and continuity may be playing a big role in how well they work together, even though the Packers are adding 1 new player.
Yeah, and the other thing is the Packers' 6th and 7th guys are the second best of this group. So maybe we like the depth of the Packers a little bit more than some of these other teams. Only the Vikings are higher. And then even for the Vikings, those 6th and 7th guys are career backups, whereas the Packers' 6th and 7th guys have a little bit more pedigree, with Morgan a first rounder, Belton a second rounder. So I think the depth of the Packers is probably better than some of these other teams. So there is that as well.
And you could argue the depth of the Packers have more upside.
Yeah.
So that they don't, and the thing is, they don't necessarily have to hit this early in their careers because they're depth pieces. They could be depth pieces, and if they move up, that means they're playing well.
And okay, let's talk about it a little bit just for a second. if Jordan Morgan doesn't get a starting spot this year, which we're not projecting him to in this projection, how do you feel about that?
It's just joins a long list of recent Packers first rounders who don't contribute for like half of the rookie contract.
Right? It's like, it doesn't feel great if he can't beat out Sean Ryan. I mean, Sean Ryan was better than we thought he would be last year, but it doesn't feel amazing.
Yeah, it does. The other thing, and I've had this thought before, this philosophy of picking projects who take a couple years to develop means you are canceling out the kind of rookie pay scale advantage that you get in large part by picking guys. Okay, these guys take a couple years to develop. It's like, well, then the advantage you get from having one rookie contract goes away.
It's true. Yeah. And I think part of that, though, is when you're picking in the 20s, it's hard to get immediate contributors with high ceilings. Maybe that's like or at premium positions with high ceiling. And so they're like, okay, we want, like, if the three things are like premium position, immediate contributor, high ceiling, I think they're like, okay, we'll
top five,
and we can. And they're like, we can only pick two of those. I think they're like, I guess we won't pick immediate contributor. Like, we'd rather have premium position, high ceiling. Maybe is like the thought there. I don't know, but I agree with you because we've seen that you only get a couple years out of that rookie contract, and a lot of these other teams that are competing at the highest level have immediate contributors on rookie contracts, and that's how they're able to build these awesome rosters around that.
They get like 3 to 5 years of good play on a rookie contract instead of 2.
Well, it's like you look at the Eagles and like their best defender is Jalen Carter. He's making like no money, but he's been their best defender for like 2 years now. So it's like that's something
they
to
kind of lucked into that one. People were afraid to pick him.
Yeah, it's true.
So he went later than his talent would have suggested.
Yeah, and it worked out for them. But yeah, so in terms of the offensive line, I in terms of looking at Morgan, I really hope he wins the starting spot because it does feel like for him to get better, he also needs to play. And whether that's at left tackle, whether that's at right guard, I would hope he could win a starting spot at one of those two. As kind of like going into your second year as a first rounder, you were kind of banged up a little bit in training camp last year. You didn't get the full chance to get all those snaps. I would hopefully, with a healthy offseason, he's able to win a spot there.
Yeah, and I think he was probably it was looking like he was going to win a spot before he got the first shoulder injury in the summer.
Yeah, he was already getting those first team reps at right guard. He was building towards it, and then he gets that shoulder injury, and then he's rotating in at right guard with Sean Ryan, and then the shoulder gets hurt again, and he's out for the year. And yeah, it was just a bit of a lost season for him. And, that's unfortunate, but hopefully, he can bounce back this year. Anything else on the offensive line you wanted to talk about, or do you want to move on to wide receivers?
We can move on to wide receivers. So,
Okay, what are those rankings looking like?
So here, I was a little surprised, but the Lions were number one. On their snap share adjusted grade with a 77.4.
Yeah,
and that's a 5.5-ish improvement over last year's. And I think this is mostly like everybody on the depth chart had a pretty good grade last year for them. Like, what all everybody in the 70s are like their top 3.
Yeah, because
Amon-Ra had had a monster year at 89, so he had the best actually grade in the division.
Yeah,
for a receiver.
I will say I do feel like this is a rising tide, all ship situation where it's like that offense was so good last year that like everyone graded out amazing, and so like they're gonna have a really highly graded receiving group just because the team offense was so dynamic and awesome, and because like on paper I think most people would take the Vikings just because Jefferson is so good, or the Bears because they have so much invested in that group. But the Lions, by the grades and by the snap shares, did have a better year last year.
Yeah, and part of that is so they had even their number 4 receiver graded over 70. So, and compared to the Packers, who have, one player who graded over 70 last year.
I mean, if the Packers could just catch the ball, imagine how good they'd be. Imagine how good we'd be if we could catch the ball.
Yeah. So the Lions, based on last year's numbers, are projected to finish first. So we are not adjusting these grades based on what we think is going to happen. Otherwise, like all three of the other teams would maybe be in the 50s at every position.
we're not regressing everyone back to the mean. just and regress to the mean and regress to the mean. But anyway, Lions first. Who's second?
And then the Vikings. They couldn't imagine them being any lower, with a 72.6, mostly behind Jefferson's year, but also Addison had a good year last year. His actually grade was better than anybody on any player on the Packers, but their other players did not contribute as much. So they had a more of a drop off in positions 3, 4, and 5 than the Lions did. And so they ended up at second at 72.6, an improvement over the previous year, was the projection. And then finishing third with the Packers, who have a projected of 70.3. Golden's contribution. So this is...
You're projecting Golden as wide receiver 3 here.
In terms of snap, right. So that could have been from 1 to 5. So that's a bit of a guess. And I left Reed as number 1 in snap share because he was number 1 in snap share last year.
Yeah, fair.
And so their overall grade was a 70.3, which is down from last year's projection. So after 2023, we were projecting they were going to have a team grade of 74.1. And
then everyone got worse. That's kind of how it went. Yeah, it's kind of how it went.
So if they, that same projection this year would have, put them in number 2, would have put them ahead of the Vikings going into this coming year. And the Bears are, despite all of the investment you've talked about, they're projected pretty solidly in last at 68.6.
And this
way
is
down from last year's projection.
This is whatever the opposite of a rising tide lifts all ships is. This is a sinking tide sinks all ships.
Right. Like a sinking ship pulls everything down with it. It's because it
was like the offense was so bad last year that none of the receivers were going to grade out well.
It is producing a whirlpool as it pulls everybody else under. And they had a 68.6 grade. And last year we had them with 75.2 projected, which was number 1 in the division. They're projected to have the best receiving group.
I mean, on paper, it's like, well, last year they also had Keenan Allen, but you just replace him with, Luther Burden now. But you got DJ Moore, who's like a highly paid receiver. You got Rome Odunze, who was a top 10 pick the year before. You got Luther Burden, like I mentioned, is a round 2 pick, and some people liked Moore. I wasn't as high on him, but we'll see. And then, Zacchaeus is fine and Duvernay is fine. But, like, in terms of top-level talent, like, you got the investment there.
Yeah, and going into last year, Moore and Keenan Allen had fantastic years going into in 2023 going to last year. And you expected to get a lot more out of Odunze as a first-round pick than you did in the end. So that was, I think, just one of those, the environment just torpedoed
anything. Yeah, anything and everything. And so
Bears fans might say, like, okay, so we're going to be better, you're saying, than you would be based on last year's numbers.
Yeah, and I think that's the hope, that's the expectation. Like with all the investment they've had there, bringing in a new coaching staff, like they should be better this year for sure. Looking at the rankings, like that's one thing to keep in mind of how these rankings might be different is like that's the big thing I would say. Of all of these things to look at, I think it's like when you look at the investment the Bears have made and then changing over the coaching staff, I think it's fair to assume that like those numbers are going to be a lot better than last year. Like I think I would imagine they would be. And then also, I think one of the other things is like how much does Golden contribute right away for the Packers? That could also, shift these rankings a little bit. And then, how much does, losing Ben Johnson kind of shake up the passing game a little bit for the Lions? And are those guys a little bit less, maybe less efficient? Although, bringing in John Morton as the offensive coordinator, they've been talking, I think, a little bit about it. Sounds like more play action shots. And so maybe Jamison Williams is more involved this year and is getting more targets, more usage. So that's something to keep in mind. But anyway, just kind of like looking at, like trying to read the tea leaves there. There are ways that this could shake up a little bit.
Yeah. And so we'll see if the Bears, maybe the biggest, adding a new coach, but also the offensive line improvement.
Yeah, able to, have some more time to throw should help the passing game and then should help the wide receivers.
Yeah, I think the whole idea for the Bears seems to be like, okay, we're going all in and finding out just how good Caleb Williams can be by getting everything right around him this time, as opposed to not getting everything right around him as a rookie.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, like, The quarterback is the most important position maybe in all of sports. And so like making sure they have the tools to succeed is like equally the most important thing. And, last year going into the year, I think a lot of people thought like, hey, because I remember people were saying like, this is the best situation a first overall pick has ever gone into, given like the weapons that they had. People were higher on the coaching staff than the coaching staff ended up being, the offensive line people were higher on it than it ended up being. And so I think they just don't want a repeat of last year. Like they're just they're like, we cannot afford to have a repeat of last year. And so if we end up putting, too much into the offense, that's fine. Whatever. Like there's no such thing as too much investment in the offense because they need to get this right pretty much.
Yeah, both to find, make it so that Caleb Williams can play well, but also find out how well can he play. Teams always need to know if, whether or not somebody's the guy.
Yeah, fair. But yeah, so for the receiver room, I think there are ways that this could shake up. Also, if the Packers hopefully don't have as big of a drop issue this year with the receiver room, hopefully those numbers move up. And so like we get just some natural regression from like leading the league in drops to maybe like 10th in the league in drops, hopefully, maybe even like just like maybe like still not great, but maybe not the worst in the league, not two guys in the top 5 in drop rate in the league. Maybe we just get some regression there, and that helps with the Packers receiver room as a whole looking better, possibly. That's also an option.
Yeah, so it would be nice to get, even if they just regress to like some like rookie year numbers for a couple of those players, they don't even have to be. And we talked about this earlier, that you do, when players play worse in their second year, can you expect them to improve in their third year? And the answer is generally yes.
Yeah, usually there's a bounce back, there's a regression. And then also, we just have no idea what Watson's going to be this year. So we'll see later in the year. Moving on to our next position group, though, running back. What do you got there?
So basically what we've got is like 2 elite teams, one really good team and one just, about average team. So the Lions had a grade for the group at 86, and the Packers at almost 85. So the two of them were really, really good. The Packers carried by Jacobs like 92 grade, the best in the division actually, and Gibbs I think was second. So they're really pulling up their position groups.
Yeah, shout out the Packers offensive line for letting Jacobs, get those high grades by making him make someone miss behind the line every single play.
Yeah, his yards after contact was elite last year. And then the third was the Vikings with a 71.6, weighted grade, and the Bears down at 63, so just barely above average. The Packers were much better last year than expected going in. I was looking at it. Last year, expecting a 68, not an 85.
Well, yeah, that was coming off of a really poor year from Josh Jacobs in 2023, and then he bounced back big time in 2024.
Yeah, we didn't go back to his much better 2022 grade when we were projecting what he would do last year, and so really he was closer to that than he was to his 2023 grade. And the Lions were also better than projected going in. I think they got an 86 instead of a 78 we had expected going in. And the Vikings were kind of close to what we expected, as were the Bears were not as, the Bears are about just a little bit worse than they were expected going into last year. Yeah. So we'll see if, Ben Johnson's run game,
there's a lot of
works for the Bears or not.
Exactly. There's a lot of changes, Ben Johnson bringing, more like a more planned out, I would say is fair to say, run game to the Bears than they had previously.
Having a plan?
Them having better interior offensive line, maybe helping the run game. And then, the Lions, does their run game take a step back? Without Ragnow, you kind of assume it would. And without Ben Johnson as well, you kind of assume it would. And then, looking down the line, the Vikings, obviously, I think one of the big reasons they made a lot of those additions to the interior offensive line is they want a better run game. That was something that I think was really lacking from their offense last year, especially at the end of the year. They just could not run the football. And so I think that was a big impetus behind the idea of like, hey, we need 3 new interior offensive line pieces. And then bringing in Jordan Mason as kind of a, also a secondary back to, have a better number 2 option there. And so I would imagine that the Vikings and Bears run games should improve this year with the investments that they've made. And then you'd imagine the Lions would take, at least a small step back with, the losses along the offensive line and the coaching staff. I think the question is for the Packers. And I think I'm thinking there's going to be a step back there as well, because despite more additions along the offensive line with, Myers heading out and Banks coming in and some improvement there, I just think it's really hard to assume that Jacobs is going to take on the same kind of workload that he had last year, which we've talked about previously. We talked about that in our lingering questions about the Packers is can we assume Jacobs can do this 2 years in a row? Historically, it has not happened. Historically, players who have had 300 carries have gone down in yards per game, yards per carry, total yards, all of those things go down the next year. And so I think it's fair to assume that the Packers running game maybe takes a step back as well there too. Now the question is, how much can Marshawn Lloyd contribute? That's the question.
Right. And for this, Lloyd only played 10 snaps in the regular season, so we kept his rookie evaluation in, as it were, rather than last year, because it was just such a small sample size. It really has no meaning in terms of figuring out how good somebody is. But I should mention that last year, Wilson also had a fantastic grade. Not quite as high as Jacob, but still at 82.9.
He's a very solid grade. Player. Yeah.
So it may be that, Jacobs will take less of a load, but we're actually looking pretty good in terms of our backups.
Well, so the thing with the backups for the Packers, and we're going to get a little Packers-centric for a second. Wilson, I think, is the best runner of any of the three backups. Now, we have no idea what Lloyd is. We just don't know. I think Lloyd probably has the best home run threat ability, best big play ability. But the question still, which, we've kind of pushed back because it's been a year since he was drafted, fumbles. He was really bad about putting the ball on small hands. Yeah. He was really bad about putting the ball on the floor when he was at USC. Wilson, I think, is the best runner of the group, but he can't do the third down work stuff that Brooks can do. Now, hopefully he can get a little bit better at that, but I don't know if he's as good of a pass blocker or a pass catcher as Brooks is. Brooks, meanwhile, I think is steady Eddie at those things, but he's not nearly the runner that Wilson is. Lloyd is the question mark because we just haven't seen any of it. We have no idea how good he is, but they did invest day 2 draft capital in him, and we're very high on him. So
as were other draft pundits.
Yeah, Daniel Jeremiah had him as his best running back in the entire class in 2024. So
and he was looking good in the training camp.
I was going to say in training, I don't think he didn't play in preseason. So I was no, he did not. But yes, in training camp, he was looking good, reportedly. Andy Herman said he was the best running back in training camp practices. So do with that what you will. Training camp or mini camp, actually, I can't remember. But anyway,
I think it was training camp.
In practices. So I think the depth for the Packers running back room is a major question mark, not necessarily in quality, but just in who it's going to be and who's going to get the second running back share, which is probably, you'd have to assume, going to be a bigger slice of the pie than it was last year.
It may turn out this is going to be more like the Lions, where you have, it's not dominated so much because the difference between Gibbs and Montgomery in terms of snap share is not nearly as high as the difference between Jacobs and number 2 on the Packers.
Yes.
So I would expect that those two to get a little closer together.
I would say closer together, but what you have to look at with the Lions is which David Montgomery will say is the second guy there. He's just so much more established and proven than any of the second guys for the Packers. We just don't I think it'd be a bit of a leap to assume that they could contribute as much as he does.
No, I think it's more that if Jacobs has to take on a lighter load from last year's heavy load, that I would expect to see the 2 and 3 to take more.
Totally.
And perhaps the improvement in the offensive line run blocking will make up any difference we have from Jacobs not being quite as elite this year as he was last year.
And I think that's the hope for the Packers. I just feel like him taking a lighter workload, whether it's because of injury or just because of wear and tear, or them just wanting to, go a little lighter on him, which I think they should. I don't think they should try and give him 300 carries again. I honestly don't think they should have done it last year, but it worked out. I just think that that's going to naturally make the run game a little worse because he's clearly their best running back. So that's just kind of what I'm thinking there.
Yeah. I mean, he was really, really good last year.
Really, really good.
You could argue he was the third best running back in the league last year.
That's a good question. I don't know if I agree, but he's definitely in the conversation for because it's what Saquon, obviously, Derrick Henry probably as well. And then you're getting into a conversation where does Bijan Robinson rank? James Cook had a great year for the Bills. Going down the list. But there were a lot of good running back seasons last year, and he's definitely in the conversation for that third one. But anyway, anything else on the running back group that you wanted to look at there, or do you want to move on to tight ends and wrap this thing up?
We can move on to tight ends and wrap this things up. I think we speculated on all kinds of fronts on the running back, and
it's my favorite thing to do.
Complications they're in.
I think it's therein. But anyway, tight ends, how are we looking?
So here is, it's a little messy because the snap share distribution is different from team to team. So you run into differences in how much the depth matters on some teams versus others. But the number one ranking was the Vikings with a grade of 73, and then it's a pretty substantial drop off in a cluster for the other two teams, with the Lions at 64.4, the Packers at 62.9, the Bears last at 62.5. So really like barely any difference. And the Lions and the Packers were kind of similar to last year. The projection, the Bears finished significantly worse last year than we expected, and the Vikings were about what we expected. And so the Bears are not projected to be as good as next year. And part of it is maybe because the average rookie tight end, who's their number one tight end going in the depth chart, Loveland, is not generally expected to do that much.
Yeah, it's like Packers, rookie tight ends, it's one of those positions that takes a couple of years usually to contribute right away. Now, there are exceptions, but usually it takes a couple of years to fully, because the tight ends have to learn the passing game and the running game, and the run blocking schemes, and it's just a big mental load and then also a big physical load as well. So usually it's like a year or two before those guys really hit their strides.
Yeah, and the Vikings are helped that both their top two tight ends both had a pretty good year, graded over 74. And the Packers are hurt by the fact that Musgrave had a really down second year with a grade of only 47.
Let's talk about Musgrave.
Even though Kraft was good.
What are your thoughts on Musgrave going forward? What are your expectations and what are your thoughts?
My expectations is going to have a year like his rookie year, but healthier.
Okay. 300 yards, 350? I don't think there's I don't want to see any one tight end set where Musgrave is playing ahead of Kraft.
I agree with that.
Kraft is clearly better.
Player.
Yeah, clearly better. Like large gap better, much better. I just wonder, do I really want to see Musgrave that much more than the third wide receiver?
I think it depends on what kind of looks you want to give. If you could sell the run and then get advantageous passing game matchups. That would be the argument for doing the two tight end set and having a pretty fast tight end out there, moving over into the slot against a linebacker.
I think that does kind of hinge on Musgrave being a above average blocker. Right?
Yeah.
So I do think that's a question mark there. He's a fine blocker, but I think he would have to be above average, is kind of my opinion there.
The thing is, you and I both like Kraft more than Musgrave.
Coming out of the draft.
Coming out of college in the draft. And I don't think people give enough credit to the tight ends who end up good are the guys who run people over and break
their
tackles.
Guys. Yeah. Obviously, we know if you're going to be a good tight end in the NFL, usually you have to be an elite athlete, almost always. But I do think there's something to be said that in addition to that, you really need to have good contact balance. Because the thing with Musgrave is he can't turn. He can't take a hit. He goes down on first contact way too often. And he's just it's kind of like a baby deer out there. He's really all legs.
Bambi on ice.
Yeah. He's really all legs out there. And so I think there's room for him to improve, obviously. And if he can reach that ceiling, there's a lot of untapped potential there. I just don't think that I think I have questions about him playing at the expense of other guys, I guess is my thought. And I get that 12 personnel should be easier to run out of, give different looks. You can pass out of it into heavier personnel sets from the defense, and that gives you mismatches. I just don't know if he is is it good to be putting worse players on the field just to do that? I guess is my question.
So your argument is do you want to see Musgrave on the field or Reed?
Yeah. That's my thought. Right? Do I want to see Musgrave on the field? Do I want to see Musgrave on the field or Dobbs? Do I want to see Musgrave on the field or Reed? Do I that? That's just my thought. It's do I yes, the personnel looks should give you more advantageous looks, but in my opinion, you're just putting a worse player out there, which I'm sure the defense would be like, I mean, hey, if you want to play your second tight end over your like star slot receiver, be my guest. Like, is probably what they're thinking. So, and that's a more traditional 12 look. Obviously you could have like two tight ends on the field and then both receivers on one side and Reed could still be in the slot. But that's just my thought around the thing. But anything else, like other tight ends in the division, what are your thoughts on them? Obviously, we already talked about, Loveland. Sometimes it's hard to have an impact as a rookie, but we'll see. They did pick him very high, and we've seen Ben Johnson use rookie tight ends, pretty, involved before with Sam Laporta of the Lions. So we've seen that before from his offenses. For the Vikings, Hawkinson's just a very solid player. Like, this is a very, very good tight end, very respectable tight end. So you'd imagine he'd keep contributing in the way that he has. But, different quarterback there. Maybe he gets less looks, but it's hard to tell. But any thoughts on the rest of this, tight end group?
Well, I would say you have three teams that have an established tight end. We know they're good. They know they've done it in the past with Kraft for the Packers, Laporta for the Lions, and Hawkinson for the Vikings. The Bears are a total unknown here.
Well, and I would say, I know that they just, drafted a guy in the top 10 to replace him, but I've always thought Cole Kmet is solid. He's a pretty good player. They gave him a pretty decent extension, but now he's their number 2. But so, like, if we're looking at, number 2 tight ends in the division, I think they clearly have the best second guy.
Musgrave season. But the guy who actually had the best grade last year as number 2 tight end is actually Oliver for the Vikings.
But like I said, this is the sinking ship takes down everything around it. The Bears offense was just such a struggle last year that I think everyone graded out poorly. But yeah. So like the tight end rooms, I think it's, like you mentioned, we have 3 of the number 1 guys on the depth chart. We have 3 guys who are pretty established and then 1 guy who's a rookie. So a bit of a question mark.
Yeah. And I think that kind of sums it up.
Yeah. But overall rankings, kind of wrapping this whole thing up, how are we looking?
So the Lions are first again with an average score of 75.9 across the whole offense. Packers number 2 at 72.4, followed by the Vikings at 71.3, and the Bears at 67.1, significantly behind. Despite all their improvements, they're still way behind everybody else.
And part of that is, because of just how rough it was last year for them, I think is something to point out.
And also, part of the Lions being so high is how good the environment was for everybody last year. I mean, some of that is taken away from the offensive line group when you take away Ragnow and you replace him. Then, the overall offensive line group took a hit. But what's not baked into that is how that affects all of the other groups.
Yeah.
We have not calculated or tried even, and maybe it would be unfair to try, how much you should knock down the QB room, the running back room, and the wide receiver room because the offensive line got worse.
And we're not even necessarily calculating we're taking Ragnow out, but how does that affect the other guard spots? Like, how does losing a starting center, like a starting Pro Bowl center, like the guards are probably going to play a little bit worse now because they have less help from such an impact player. That's also something to keep in mind as well. But, kind of keeping in mind, like with these rankings, I think we're still with these projections. Keep in mind, I think we both think that, in terms of looking at ecosystem changes, we kind of expect all these rankings to flatten out a little bit as the Bears ecosystem gets better and the Lions ecosystem gets a little bit worse. And then things are going to be, I think, just really tight in the NFC North this year, I think is my big takeaway, is that this is going to be probably, again, the best division in football. Now, the best division in football won 0 playoff games last year. So ultimately,
the best regular season division.
We were the best regular season division last year. And then all three of the teams that made the playoffs did not win a playoff game. So there's that. But I do think this is going to be a very competitive division with a chance to send 3 teams to the playoffs, maybe even 4, who knows? Once again, we'll see. I think it's going to be really competitive and it's going to be, a dogfight in the division.
Yeah, it should be another fun year. I heard somebody else says, like, I like it when other teams are bad and we win easy and don't stress over the games and dominate the division and have a walk to the playoffs.
Yeah, I do. I like that. I'd like to dominate the division.
Like, I'll save those nail biters for 2 teams I don't care about.
Yeah. But anyway, so this has been our projections for the offenses of the NFC North. We did the defenses last week if you want to go listen to that. Like we said, I think it's going to be a really good division, a really fun division. Strong quarterbacks, strong play callers, strong rosters. And so I think just a really strong division overall. Should be a lot of fun to watch. But anyway, thank you again so much for listening. If you like what you heard, like, subscribe, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, tell a friend, leave a comment, follow us on Blue Sky at Father Son Packer. And thank you again so much for listening. And until next time, go Pack Go.
Go Pack Go.